Welcome to the eighth session of our 2022-2023 Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group. This year's talk centers around this theme, Legacies of Injustice. The theme encompasses a broad range of injustices in both the past and the present, which are connected to a complex web of colonial issues.
Without further delay, we would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Elias Michaut. Elias is a research assistant at the Department of Archaeology at Cambridge and a field archaeologist at the Cambridge Archaeological Units. They hold a bachelor's and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. Their most recent research has focused on the historical archaeology of the landscape of emancipation of northwestern Senegal in collaboration with the UCAD of Dakar. They've just finished writing an article about racial capitalism and the androcentrism of memories of enslavement in Senegal, and they are particularly interested in colonialism and its ongoing legacies, gender, critical theory, and social inequalities. Elias' topic today will be freedom, villages, necropolitics, and the creation of racial capitalist landscapes in the lower Senegal basin. Welcome, Elias. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing me. I'm now going to share my screen. Good. So can you all see my slides? Perfect. And can you all hear me well? Yeah. In that case, I'm going to start. So hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Elias, and today I'm going to present about the heritage and archaeology of the freedom villages in northern Senegal. First, some content notes. There will be frequent mentions of racism and colonial violence in this presentation. So to begin, archaeological studies of enslavement initially emerged as a subdiscipline in the wake of the 1970s African-American civil rights movement. The desire to historicize enslavement has led to both studies of slave raiding and emancipation. However, despite the growth of this subdiscipline, archaeological studies of emancipation have remained relatively rare in Africa, and only very few papers deal with this subject. This study comes from a collaborative project funded by the Cambridge Africa Alborada Trust between the University of Cambridge and the University Sheikh Anta Diop of Dakar. The aim of the project was to study the heritage of the freedom villages in northern Senegal. So freedom villages are a series of 19th century settlements associated with formerly enslaved people. They were in many cases directly created by the French administration to keep controlling and exploiting liberated people, even after emancipation. Researchers from Cambridge who took part in the project were myself and Professor Paul Lane, while researchers from Dakar included Professor Ibrahim Mathieu and doctoral students Youssou Touré and René Ndianafai. As part of the project, I initially got to spend some time first in the former French colonial archives in southern France, and later in Senegal for a month, where I conducted further archival research and took part in archaeological fieldwork with my Senegalese colleagues. So, to begin, according to historians, Wall of Society, that is the Wolof are the main ethnic group in Senegal. So Wolof society was divided according to a caste system since before the arrival of Europeans. However, the imposition of the transatlantic slave trade accentuated these social hierarchies and led to the formation of an increasingly large enslaved population. In northern Senegal, the main French trading post and later colonial capital was the city of Saint-Louis, founded in 1659. According to a census present in the French archive, about 50% of the population of Saint-Louis in 1845 was enslaved, and of this, 60% were enslaved women. The economy of the city and its hinterland therefore relied intensely on this enslaved labor, which was itself heavily gendered. The transatlantic slave trade was first prohibited in 1818. This resulted in the creation of a system of indentured labor, where wealthy owners were able to acquire enslaved people as long as they promised to free them after 14 years. Both enslavement and indenture were eventually abolished in the French Empire in 1848. However, there's a small trick here, which is that in Senegal, this only applied to the colonial cities of Saint-Louis and Gorée, which are both on the coast, and while enslavement continued to exist in the rest of the country. The coexistence of these two systems led to an influx of enslaved people coming from neighboring Senegalese kingdoms into Saint-Louis to seek freedom. So, for instance, in the year directly following abolition in 1848, around 4,000 enslaved people arrived in the city from Cayo, a neighboring kingdom south of Saint-Louis. Enslavement was eventually abolished in the rest of Senegal only in 1905. That means that for half a century, this therefore created a palimpsest of overlapping diasporas in the region, where movements of enslaved people seeking freedom, people escaping wars and slave raids, and people simply seeking economic opportunities in the colonial capital often became indistinguishable. It's in this context that the colonial administration created settlements called freedom villages to contain this influx of freed people to the city. Freedom villages enabled the administration to both keep formerly enslaved people at a distance from the wealthy urban elite, while also being able to control them and keep exploiting their labor. In the region of Saint-Louis, there are 5 main freedom villages created or at least surveilled by the French administration. 2 were located directly at the outskirts of the city of Saint-Louis, Ndar-Toute and Seoul, and 3 others were further in the hinterland, Lampsar, Merinagan, and Njaago. Lampsar will be the main focus of this research. So I started my research by spending a week in the French National Overseas Archive in southern France, which still holds many documents from the colonial period in Senegal. A researcher from Senegal was originally supposed to take the trip, but because of COVID restriction and because I'm French myself, it was decided that it would be easier if I went and shared scans of the interesting material with my Senegalese colleague. During my trip to Senegal later in April, I also spent several weeks researching in the National Archives of Senegal. This archival research forms part of the basis for my dissertation. So the village of Lampsar, which I mentioned before, is located 25 kilometers northeast of Saint-Louis. It was chosen for a more in-depth archaeological study because of its proximity to Saint-Louis and because a member of the team, Youssou Touré, had already collected oral histories there. According to the local oral tradition, which I recorded through an interview with an elder of the village, local families settled in the area around the 16th century. The original settlement is today known as Njaago and is located directly northeast of the contemporary settlement of Lampsar. In 1842, a French post was built nearby. The post was established to protect trade routes in the hinterland of Saint-Louis from raids by Mauritanian communities which disrupted the colonial supply chain. The movement from Njaago to Lampsar was a movement to get closer to this fort and can be dated to the mid-19th century. This period also corresponds with an influx of newcomer populations, mostly of enslaved origin, attracted by the principle of the freeing soil that applied to areas around French outposts. These formerly enslaved people were of a variety of ethnic origins, but were eventually integrated into the local community, and their descendants today all self-identify as Wolof. In Njaago, we excavated 2 middens. The characteristic of the pottery found in Njaago coincided perfectly with the subactual pottery tradition, which was common to all of northern Senegal between the 16th and 19th century. Its coarse paste and absence of decoration have been tied to increased political instability. The presence of subactual pottery therefore corroborates the chronology of the oral historians. Some locally made and decorated tobacco pipes were also uncovered, and a few beads, both locally made and European, were found in the middens. 2 test pits were also realized in Lampsar. The complete absence of beads and tobacco pipes, and also glass in these test pits in Lampsar, raised several questions which will be addressed later. The ceramic from Lampsar was very similar to the pottery found on the surface of the middens in Njaago, supporting the continuity between the 2 settlements, also evidenced by the oral history. So with regard to Lampsar Fort, Lampsar Fort was built in 1842 on a dune overlooking the floodplain to protect imperial trade routes from frequent raiding. According to historical maps and archival sources, the soldiers stationed in the outpost were mainly indigenous soldiers and convicts mobilized for military service. The French seem to have also been using the surrounding landscape, building barracks for soldiers outside the fort, as well as an infirmary, kitchens, and a small bakery. The fort was eventually completely destroyed in the 1960s and 1970s, and its rubble were used to build new houses. It was decided to do some archaeological prospection to map the remains of the fort. Ruins of a wall surfacing in a private field overlooking the river were identified. Knowing the size of the fort, it was possible to identify other traces of walling, which enabled an approximation of the overall fort's footprint. The soil within the fort seemed very disturbed, likely resulting from its destruction, and some areas seem to have been used to dump rubbish in recent years. Surface artifacts included objects commonly associated with European presence, such as shards of glass bottles and faience. A path leading to the river was in use by local inhabitants about 40 to 50 meters north of the location of the fort. This was very informative, since a path with a similar shape and length was visible on an 1865 map. Paths indeed were some of the elements facilitating imperial operations in the landscape and have been the objects of archaeological inquiry. It is likely that the path used today in Lampsar by local inhabitants is the same path that was used a century and a half ago by the indigenous soldiers and convict soldiers of the garrison of the fort. So, from the interviews in Lampsar, there appeared to be a divide between some of the elders of the village, for whom the local history of enslavement is still partly a source of shame, and younger generation who explicitly expressed a desire to learn and remember their history. One of the ways to return to the local community some of the knowledge produced by this study was to create 2 posters in French to be exhibited at the local primary school of Lampsar. The first one, which you can see here, focused on the archaeological season at Lampsar, presenting a brief history of the village, the work of archaeologists, and some of the finds uncovered during the 2022 excavations. Youssou Touré, who is currently doing his PhD on Lampsar, is also continuing to conduct interviews among the inhabitants and produce more detailed oral histories. So, of the 5 freedom villages created after 1848, Lampsar, Merinagan, and Njaago were located next to colonial forts, while Ndar-Toute and Soul were heavily surveilled by the colonial administration. These increasingly militarized landscapes are clearly visible on historical maps. For instance, the freedom village of Ndar-Toute was enclosed by a fence. Houses were organized according to a grid pattern, and the military regularly surveilled the site to ensure that no one would leave unauthorized. In some areas, this surveillance continued for decades. For instance, this is a map that you can see here of the freedom village of Njaago in 1879. It shows that after 3 decades, the militarized landscape directly surrounding Njaago had largely expanded, with the addition of soldier barracks and other military units. Large gardens cultivated by the villagers for feeding the military troops were also located directly next to the village. These maps illustrate how freed people in these settlements came to be seen as a reserve army of labor. In Njaago, the military administration used the inhabitants to toil the gardens to feed the army, while in Ndar-Toute, inhabitants were kept segregated and served the wealthy urban elite as a cheap domestic labor force. The disposability of formerly enslaved people in freedom villages was central to their exploitation. Denning has written that capitalism begins not with the offer of work, but with the imperative to earn a living. By making sure formerly enslaved people remain dispossessed in enclosed and disciplined spaces on the margin of society, the elite of Saint Louis ensured that their labor would remain easily extractable for colonial capitalist purposes. Freedom villages were therefore a great tool in the transition from slavery to wage labor, by creating a large reserve army of labor, readily exploitable by the colonial elite. In addition, the internment of formerly enslaved people in surveilled camps to make their labor and lives disposable is also an example of the necropolitical drive of the French administration. Necropolitics is the power of deciding who may live and who must die, and relies on making disposable the lives of specific populations, often racialized. This necropolitical drive was also visible in the use of freed people as disposable subaltern soldiers, or in the disproportionate incarceration after emancipation, mostly for minor crimes against property. So, however, formerly enslaved people were not passive bystanders to these processes, and examples of their urgency and resistance were frequent. Archival documents provide many examples of collective resistance and of the desire for autonomy of enslaved and liberated people. In 1848, in the months preceding the abolition of slavery, local administrators mentioned that enslaved people in the city had politically self-organized and formed an emancipation club which counted 500 enslaved people. The mass flight of enslaved people from the enslaver was also one of the main phenomena that eventually forced the colonial power to grant freedom. Several thousands of enslaved people fled the enslavers in the late 19th century, and most of the freedom villages mentioned earlier were formed by these fleeing enslaved people. Moreover, it has also been noted that emancipated people settlements are frequently located in marginal and isolated areas to avoid recapture. In the example presented here from the hinterland of Saint Louis, it seems that this marginal space was not spatially isolated, but rather located at the edge between local wall of words and the French colonial world. This settlement pattern could be read as an example of the agency and ingenuity of formerly enslaved people, actively positioning themselves at the boundary of these two worlds to negotiate between them and obtain freedom on their own terms. Finally, the desire for autonomy of liberated people is also perhaps visible in the material culture. As mentioned earlier, the absence of beads, tobacco pipes, and glass in the test pits in Lampsar raises several questions. Even in Jalam, imported European material was present in smaller quantities than would be expected for sites of that period, especially so closely related to Saint Louis. It is obviously possible that the areas excavated all belong to an older and forgotten period of occupation. However, two other hypotheses can also explain this absence. Either an exclusion of formerly enslaved people from local trade networks, or a desire for autonomy, and therefore an active rejection of European material culture. In addition, ceramics found in areas of Lampsar, likely associated with liberated newcomers, were more decorated and with more stylistic variation than ceramics from older areas or areas associated with higher classes. This might point to processes of innovation and world-making of formerly enslaved people, although again further analysis will be needed. Today, descendants of enslaved people in Senegal and Mali often remain stigmatized. In Lampsar, for instance, some older people refuse to discuss the matter. Building on Nora's concept of lieux de mémoire, places of memory, Rodé has proposed the term of lieux d'oubli, places of forgetting, to emphasize the non-transmission of memories in West African freedom villages, also echoing ideas of sensitive heritage. Two ways in which the stigmatization of people of enslaved descent can be visible are the social prohibition of intermarriage between people of different castes, which, however, has disappeared in Lampsar after widespread intermarriage during the 20th century, and also in the political sphere, where social identities are often weaponized against political opponents. In 2015, for instance, former Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade accused his successor of being a descendant of slaves and hence not suitable for the office. Nevertheless, there are some caveats to these legacies of stigma. Many Bamana people in Saint Louis, often of enslaved descent, have developed a sense of pride about their history. Many freed people in the years following emancipation were also able to overcome stigma by emphasizing other elements of their identity. Finally, in northern Senegal, Mali, and Mauritania, some communities of descendants of enslaved people have created a transnational association called Ndam Bilal, which has brought together more than 500,000 people to reclaim their enslaved origins and fight the stigma surrounding it. Associations such as Ndam Bilal, as well as the continued legacies of stigma, are testimonies that enslaved descent is far from forgotten knowledge. Oral interviews also corroborated this. Rodé's concept of places of forgetting might therefore be misleading. The concept of lieu privé, that is private places, might therefore be a better alternative, as memory in the freedom villages remains strong, but is not widely shared with outsiders. Although this situation is now slowly changing in Senegal, with an increased interest among younger generations in their history, and with advocacy groups such as Ndam Bilal. The work of Senegalese researchers engaged in local communities, such as that of my colleagues in Dakar, therefore also aims at challenging these legacies of stigma. So Saidia Hartman has coined the term afterlives of slavery to describe the skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment of freed people and their descendants. The term has since been used to address the contemporary violent legacies of enslavement and colonialism. In the hinterland of Saint-Louis, the 20th century was marked by mass departures of population for economic reasons. In the 1970s, 4/5 of all African immigrants to France came from the historic hinterland of Saint-Louis. The recent effects of climate change, particularly the recent widespread aridification of the region, as recorded also during interviews in Lampsar, are today intensifying this movement. Once in France, people of Senegalese descent often end up in racialized low-paid jobs. The routes taken today by Senegalese people to Europe mirror closely the ones taken during the colonial period by enslaved people and their enslavers. And the people who live today often belong to the most marginalized strata of the population, likely descendants of 19th century enslaved people. The climate crisis and local economic precarity therefore emerge from extractive phenomena which benefit nations of the global north at the expense of communities in the global south, the latter also being the most directly affected by climate change effects. The hinterland of Saint-Louis is at the receiving end of this dynamic, historically exploited for its labor and resources, and today suffering from the destructive effects of the global climate crisis and neo-colonial exploitation. Building on ideas of wealth reparations for descendants of enslaved people, researchers such as Olufemi Taiwo have made the case for climate reparations to be paid by nations of the global north to communities of the global south affected by colonialism and the climate crisis. Archaeologists and heritage specialists from affected local communities therefore stand on the front line of researchers who will be able to wade into these discussions. Finally, the intersection between emancipation, racial capitalism, and carceral geographies is also one worth exploring. Angela Davis, writing about the United States, has highlighted the role of incarceration as the perpetuation of enslavement and as the reproduction of the disposability of Black bodies. This perspective finds a strong illustration in the landscape of emancipation of colonial Saint-Louis, initially with the use of fears about vagrancy to confine recently freed people in freedom villages, and later with the creation of colonial jails used as a tool of social control to exclude formerly enslaved people from the city. Penal institutions for young offenders bear the traces of these afterlives of emancipation. Well before 1911, liberated minors were entrusted to wealthy citizens. After 1912, a public orphanage was built in Richard-Toll, which had previously been the largest governmental habitation for indentured servants. And in 1917, a center for young offenders was built in Makana, the closest village south of Lampsar. The control of young offenders, which in the early 20th century was often synonymous with the control of formerly enslaved minors, therefore mapped perfectly onto the landscape of emancipation of Saint-Louis hinterland. Further studies of the early carceral institutions of Makana, Richard-Toll, and Saint-Louis therefore hold the promise of unearthing more precisely the genealogy of the modern Senegalese carceral system, and particularly its relationship with the disciplining of freed people. In summary, this research has shown how enslaved people were central agents in their own emancipation through flight and collective resistance, and how they built new lives for themselves in the freedom villages. It has also shown how this autonomy of formerly enslaved people had to face the colonial discipline and necropolitics of the French administration, which continued to exploit their labor even after emancipation. Finally, the last part has offered a call for the emergence of archaeologies of the afterlives of enslavement, which would explore the common ties and roots of disparate events such as the climate crisis, global socio-economic precarity, racial inequalities, and carceral expansion in the aftermath of enslavement and colonialism. These approaches offer a promising decolonial perspective with the potential of wider implications outside of the discipline and of helping implement meaningful material changes, for instance, by potentially weighing in debates about reparations. Thank you very much.